He's a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. I just lost my minute. Fill in for me, Seth, while I get my notes back. Seth,
so this is
Seth. You know Seth from his research.
Yeah.
He does really interesting work on the long-run impacts of same-race teachers. He's very involved in economics of labor. It takes a very interesting take on issues of great concern that are in university-wide and also here at Russ here. Please join me in welcoming Seth Gershenson.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Feel free to interrupt with questions as I go if you have any clarifying questions or any question, I guess. But I will try to save some time at the end for more general Q&A. And I say interrupt me and ask questions at the end because this is very much a work in progress. You might have seen an early draft of this circulated last spring, but we are in the process of totally swapping the order of how we arrange the paper and adding a lot of new interesting data. So your feedback will make it into the draft, hopefully, and improve it. And also, this is joint work with another Californian up north, Cassie Hart, Constance Lindsay at the Urban Institute, and Nick Papageorge at Johns Hopkins. So, to motivate the broad topic, we know that teachers are quite important. I would argue that they're the most important school-provided input. We know a lot about teachers. There's a big literature about teachers. One relevant fact or study by Chetty et al. Finds that teachers affect long-run outcomes like earnings and teen childbearing and so on. And we also know that identifying effective teachers is difficult, especially before they enter the classroom. We also know that there's racial and socioeconomic gaps in access to effective teachers. And should put an asterisk on effective because we should know what do we mean by effective. What I mean by effective is, here is what sort of the broad literature thinks about, like things like experience and certification and things like that. Although I think what you'll see in my results and what I'll argue at the end is that what it means to be an effective teacher is actually quite a bit more nuanced than sort of a broad idea about are you certified or not. And specifically that efficacy can vary depending on what type of classroom and what type of students the teacher's interacting with. But the bottom line is that we don't really know why some teachers do better than others. We know that there's big differences in some teachers' outcomes versus other teachers' students' outcomes, but we don't really know why. Part of the why and part of the sort of nuanced effectiveness idea is that we do know that same-race teachers boost current achievement. And Tom D, I would say, is sort of the seminal rigorous paper where he shows that primary school students do better on standardized tests when they have a same-race teacher. Rob Fairley et al. Shows similar thing in community college. And with a couple of my grad students at AU, we showed that this is even true in a top 100 law school, which is fairly interesting, and I think something to keep in the back of our minds because Dee's paper was looking at disadvantaged kids in very poor schools in Tennessee. Fairley's looking at a community college, which is a very different mix of students than you have here at USC or other four-year institutions. But the law school, this is a fairly good law school where the students graduated college and navigated that complicated law school admissions and made it to law school. And they're still doing better when they have a same-sex or same-race instructor. I think that tells us something sort of about the broad dimensions of this phenomenon. It's not limited to disadvantaged students. Okay, but all of these things are looking at contemporaneous effects. In other words, having a same-race teacher today affects my test score this year. We also know that there's current effects on attendance and suspensions. And we also know that there's current effects on the teacher's expectations. But if you notice, all of these bullets have the word current in them, right? And we don't know whether these effects persist on the outcomes we care about because we don't really care about test scores in and of themselves, right? That's just a proxy for learning or skills or potential in the future. And this is really important to note because we know that teachers' effects on test scores fade out in a few years, but their effects on long-run outcomes like college going and earnings persist. So the question then is this race match effect, whatever mechanism through which that's occurring, does that race match effect explain the long-run effects in Chetty? I.e., do these long-run effects persist on the long-run outcomes that we care about, like college going, labor market success, et cetera? Okay, and this is, I think, particularly salient given the recent New York Times Upshot article that featured Chetty's new work that has the diagram that many of you have seen about black and white students board in the top quintile of the earnings distribution. That suggests that there's something more than socioeconomic status going on here, right? Okay, so without further ado, we are going to sort of blend these two literatures on race match effects and long-run effects of teachers to specifically ask, do same-race teacher effects extend to long-run outcomes that we really care about? Specifically, what I'll show you today is results for high school graduation, self-reported student college intent, and objective records of whether or not students took the SAT or ACT college entrance exams. What I can show you, but could show you in a few months if you have me back, is actual college enrollment and college graduation. So we just got the National Student Clearinghouse. We just got the college data from them that merges into the STAR data. Quick correlations show that for these cohorts of black students, taking the SAT is very, very correlated with enrolling in college. It's something like 90% of kids who took the SAT enrolled in college. What I don't know, and what is really important and interesting to find out, is does this carry over to graduation? So you can follow me on Twitter and find out. And then this is the thing that I hopefully will answer clearly and convincingly. And then this is the thing that I'll wildly speculate about, and with a little bit of data. And that is sort of why do we see these effects? Because the spoiler is we do see big effects in the long run. So why? And this is really important to think about for policy, especially in the short run. We could certainly think about diversifying the teacher labor force, but it takes a while to do that. And in the short run, understanding why is important if we do anything. And there's sort of three broad reasons that you might see these long-run effects. The first is that black teachers are better than white teachers in the school that black students attend. And the second condition there is quite important because there's a lot of work about teachers sorting across schools. And we know that when teachers gain experience, they tend to move to more suburban, wealthier school districts. So this is a plausible story. Another plausible story comes back to that sort of subtle, careful definition of teacher effectiveness I mentioned, which is maybe the black teachers are better at teaching black students, which is different from number one. And finally, it could be something a little bit different. It could be more of a passive effect, like a role model effect, where the presence of black teachers changes how black students engage with school. And to be clear, these are not mutually exclusive. All could be happening to some extent. I think we mostly rule out one, although you could certainly argue about whether we really totally rule it out or not. There's suggestive evidence that three is certainly happening, but again, we'll come back to that and you can see what you think. But the main goal for the talk is to answer questions. And I mentioned that there was an earlier draft of the paper, and the paper got a lot of attention, as well, I guess from a lot of people, but including non-academics. And to sort of summarize the main results, a syndicated cartoonist wrote a cartoon about our paper, and so here's the main result. just one black teacher, so you don't need many, there's not a big dosage effect. Having one black teacher reduced high school dropout rates and increased college expectations. And Keith Knight, Nick and I talked to him, and it was a very interesting conversation about sort of what spoke to him and his experience. But one of the many things that stuck with him is the idea that it's just one. Okay, so what's remarkable, though, is that Keith's one black teacher was a substitute teacher who ran study hall, who was an aspiring cartoonist. So he didn't even want to be a teacher. He was subbing to pay the bills until he got on as a cartoonist. But this is the role model story. In study hall, young Keith Knight was sort of inspired by this substitute teacher who looked like him cartooning. And then the teacher let him sit next to him, and they doodled together, and they traded notes about cartooning. And this speaks to the mechanism a little bit, right? Or maybe a lot. And it's an anecdote, but it's an anecdote that we've heard repeated when we talk to people about their experience in K-12. Right? There was no special pedagogy here that an ed school's teaching. There's no content mastery here that an ed school's teaching. So this suggests that the role model or mechanism 3 is there. It's a thing. Of course, it doesn't mean that the other things are not happening, but this seems to be happening. Okay. So that's the plan. You know the main results in case you have to leave early. But to dig into the details a little, we're first, and this is where the talk today is different from the circulating working paper, we switched the data sets, and we're going to lead with the Project STAR data. And this was a randomized experiment conducted in Tennessee. It was designed to study class size effects, but I'll explain why this is useful to us. And then, of course, STAR was sort of this unique, quirky program. So we're going to replicate everything we do in STAR with statewide longitudinal data from North Carolina that's much richer, much bigger sample size. And remarkably, we replicate our results almost exactly. So that's neat and reassuring, and I think part of a trend moving forward is that all papers now sort of do an in-paper replication using a different data set. So that's useful. And then if we have time, we'll talk about sort of a toy model that might explain what we see, and I'll explain what I mean by this in a Bayesian updating framework. And the contribution here is to sort of formalize what we mean by role model effects, because it's a very sort of loosey-goosey term that people throw around and mean different things when they say it. We'll talk about some policy implications and wrap up. Okay. So, Project STAR. Project STAR was unique. It's non-representative because it's relatively disadvantaged schools that voluntarily opted into the program. The state legislature funded this with millions of dollars, and the experiment follows one cohort of kindergartners who entered kindergarten in 85-86, and schools were part of the experiment. And so if you were a kindergartner in any of the STAR schools, you were part of the STAR experiment. And then the experiment refreshed with new entrants to those schools for grades 1, 2, and 3. And the reason was that the STAR was designed to be a 4-year experiment. So if you were randomly assigned to a small class in kindergarten, you were supposed to have a small class in grades 1, 2, and 3 as well. But of course, that only happened if you stayed in your school. Now, again, this is a very low-income set of schools that opted into STAR because that's what was targeted by the program. And these students were highly mobile, so there was a ton of school switching. And when you switch schools, that basically means you fall out of the STAR data set. So there's sort of a well-known fact about STAR is that there's huge attrition. And that attrition is just because you switch schools. I'll deal with that in a second. But here's the thing to note. This was a class size experiment. But to really disentangle class size from other things like teacher effects and peer effects, the teachers were randomly assigned to classrooms too, right? So this means that we could leverage the random assignment of teachers as well. So Krueger 1999 is sort of the seminal rigorous analysis of STAR, although there were certainly a bunch of other analyses of STAR before that. And they find that small classes are better, and so on and so on. And then a follow-up paper looks at the longer run effects of STAR. So Krueger and Diane Schatzenbach look at SAT, ACT taking as an outcome. And just to keep this number in mind, this is exactly the same effect size that we find of having a same-race teacher. So in other words, having a small class in, say, kindergarten makes you about 5 percentage points more likely to take a college entrance exam. And we find almost the exact same size effect of having a same-race teacher in early elementary grades. So if you find this number plausible for a small class size, I'd argue that you should find our number plausible for a same-race teacher. And then Sue Donarski and Josh Hyman and Diane then linked the data to the NSC data, and Sue and Josh, in their great generosity, have helped us get the NSC data, and Josh will join as a co-author, I hope, and we'll be able to have the actual college-going data as well. So people have studied small class size effects with STAR, long-run effects, but then other people realized that we could do way more than just study small class size with STAR, because everybody was randomized and everything was randomized. So there's some famous papers about peer effects. I mentioned Tom's paper about student-teacher race match. And then Chetty's 2011 QJE paper. This is the paper that made headlines on NPR about the $1 million kindergarten classroom. And he finds that sort of the black box kindergarten classroom you get, which is the effect of the teacher and the effect of the peers and the effect of the class size, all of that together shows up in your earnings when you're 30. So what we're doing today with the STAR data is sort of blending the D paper with the Chetty paper and looking at the long-run effects of part of this black box, which is the race match. Okay, so the STAR data is good, mostly because of the random assignment, but it also has some real limitations. Really, the only good outcome we have is college entrance exams, and the reason this is good data is that they linked the STAR data to the administrative data that the SAT and the College Board and the ACT had, so there's no attrition or missing data problems. The bottom line is, if you were a STAR kid ever, and if you ever took an SAT or ACT, we know it because it's linked to the administrative data. Whether you left Tennessee or whatever doesn't matter. There's missing data with the dropout. We'll deal with that, and then the college enrollment data will be good once it gets here, but it's sitting on the computer right now. And then we have some medium run outcomes that I'll probably end up glossing over in the interest of time, but we can look at like middle school test scores and surveys in 4th and 8th grade. These have real missing data problems, so we have to be careful with how seriously we interpret them. And then we have some basic stuff about students and teachers. And sort of the basicness of this is part of the reason why the North Carolina data is going to be so helpful in a little bit. Because North Carolina data is much richer, has much more information about students and teachers, has no missing data on high school, et cetera. So to summarize the sample, we could just focus on this all column. We have about 4,200 black students who were ever in Project STAR, and 78% of them were ever eligible or ever received free lunch. And again, this is in large part because poor schools were the ones that were oversampled by STAR. And then when we think about like what's our independent right-hand side variable of interest, it's going to be this. Did you have a black teacher in your first year? You see that 43% of the black students did have a black teacher in their first year. And this is the effect that is sort of cleanly identified, because there's no compliance issues, there's no attrition issues. This is the thing we can estimate the causal effect of. And then we can also look at other functions of exposure to same-race teachers, like we can look across time and at the number and try to do things with dosage. But again, doing stuff with dosage is difficult because of attrition. And it's non-random if you change schools, and if you change schools then we don't know who your teacher was. So again, North Carolina, this is not an issue because unless you left the state, we know where you were and what school you were in and who your teacher was. So the North Carolina is going to really bolster these results. The only trade-off is we don't have an experiment there. But
Seth,
yeah.
First year black team, first year is first year in STAR.
Correct. Yep, first year in STAR. Which, for half the kids is kindergarten, 20% is first grade, and so on. Okay. And so again, if you entered STAR not in kindergarten, that means you were new to the school. So these students are a little bit odd in the sense that they switched elementary schools mid-elementary school career. So sort of because of that, a standard thing in all the STAR papers is you also estimate the regression only with the kindergarten sample, and I'll do that as well, and it doesn't really matter. And we can control for what grade you entered. Okay. So that's the plan with STAR. This is just a balance test, and the point here is that there's no stars in this table, which is good, because this is showing that the random assignment was indeed random, so I'll move on. Now, I'm going to go through the STAR results. In terms of threats to validity, I'll lay them out quickly and explain why they're not really threats. The first thing you should note is that the experiment happened within schools, right? Kids were not randomly assigned to schools, they were randomly assigned to classrooms within schools. And of course, what school you go to is not random, so we always want to make within school comparisons. In fact, given what I just said about kids can enter schools and STAR at different years, we really want to make within school, within cohort comparisons. So everything I show you will have school by cohort fixed effects. And this is what Krueger and Schatzenbach did. The next thing you might worry about, as you should worry about in any experiment, is compliance with the experimental assignment. Here too, if we focus on the first year in STAR, we're okay, because Krueger went through and checked the actual handwritten notes in the school administrative offices and found that in the first year, compliance was essentially perfect. Compliance was not perfect in subsequent years. So for example, if you were a parent and you found out that there was this experiment happening and your kid didn't get in a small class, you might complain to the principal and keep complaining until you get moved to a small class. We can correct for that by instrumenting with random assignment, but for what I'll show you today, we'll totally avoid that by only looking at the first year when the random assignment was followed, when there was perfect compliance. I mentioned attrition is a big thing in STAR, but again, you can't attrit in your first year. So again, by focusing on the first year, we avoid these attrition concerns. And then the last thing isn't necessarily a threat to validity. This is maybe more of a mechanism sort of question. And that is, what if there's within school racial differences in teacher type? So maybe there's systematic differences by race in teachers' years of experience. And we don't want to conflate the experience effect with the race match effect. So if we're worried about experience, that's something we see in the data. We can simply control for that. We also know their certification level and whether they have a master's degree. So we can control for that. We can also pool the white students with the black students and add classroom fixed effects. And when we do that, we're essentially comparing white and black kids in the same classroom, and then making it sort of, you can think about like a difference type thing, where you compare white and black kids in the same classroom with a white teacher to the racial gap between white and black kids in a classroom with a black teacher. So we can do some things to sort of rule this story out. Okay, but if all of that was just too much, just remember we're going to look at the first year assignment, and we're going to look at SAT ACT college taking as the outcome, and none of these things are problems there. So this is the simple regression that we estimate. Like USC. So this is a school by cohort fixed effect, so that's always there. This is just a match dummy for, do you have a black teacher, because this is all black kids in the sample. Remember, this is an experiment where small classes were randomly assigned, so we're going to control for that. We shouldn't have to, though, if everything was random, right? So it turns out adding the x's and adding this small class size dummy is sort of a test of whether the experiment was real or not. And it's, reassuringly, omitting these things doesn't matter, but we can include them if we want. And we'll do linear models, but logits give the same basic result. Blah, blah, blah. We can talk about standard errors later if you want. But that's what we're doing, okay? And again, there's no instruments here because the match is a match in your first year of STAR. So there's compliance is perfect. So here's the results. And starting from column 1, this is only the kindergarten cohort. So here we don't have to worry about kids coming in later. And we see in column 1 that when we have no controls, students with a match are about 5 percentage points more likely to take a college entrance exam. In column 2, we see that adding the controls doesn't change the point estimate really by much at all. It's still about 5%, still marginally significant. And then in column 3, the sample doubles because now we bring in everybody in STAR and we control for what cohort they entered. And when we bring in everybody, you'll note that the standard error falls by about half. And that's mostly just because the sample doubles. And magnitude-wise, the effect is still in the same ballpark. It's about 4 percentage points. And then in column 4, when we bring the controls back in, again, nothing budges. Unsurprising. Again, because this is a random experiment, so adding the controls shouldn't matter. And then column 5 allows the effect to vary by cohort of entry. And the idea here is, remember that this is the effect in kindergarten. This is the average effect for everybody, regardless of what your first year was. And these interactions are all insignificant and, with one exception, are close to 0. So we interpret this as there's not much heterogeneity or not much variation in the effect by cohort of entry. So we're going to stick with columns 3 and 4 as our sort of baseline model, just for power. And so using a logit doesn't change anything. Clustering standard errors doesn't change anything. Column 5 is the effect of a black teacher on white students that share a classroom with a black student. And here you see that there's a very sort of precise 0 effect of black teachers on white students. And that suggests that there's not a huge difference in sort of general across-the-board teacher quality by teacher race. So that's interesting. But I want to move on. Yeah, sure.
I'm taking you seriously when you say ask questions.
I hope, yeah.
And this is not my
Sure.
model, but I have to ask this.
Yeah.
You're looking at ACT, SAT. Is made test taking?
Yeah, just a dummy.
it-
Did you take it?
Right. Is this made at all messy by the fact that these are high poverty populations, and back at the time that there was no waivers and that these cost? In other words,
In terms of generalizability?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that they're, right? So it could be that there's there's a lot of reasons why a student may or may not take the ACT or SAT that might have to do also with income and knowledge. And,
Absolutely.
okay, so
Yeah.
can you help me understand that?
So that's not a big, so that's why the experiment is so valuable. So these are almost all relatively poor kids. and all of these estimates are coming from comparing
Got that.
black kids who are in the same school.
So they're all the same income, so, yeah.
They're all in the same school, and one of them randomly, because of the class size experiment, randomly got a black teacher. One of them randomly got a white teacher. And so, if the experiment was valid, then all those other differences between the two kids are washed away, right? Because what are you worried about? Maybe you're worried that of these two black kids, the one with the more involved parents called the principal and made sure that they had a black teacher because they knew about the role model effect and they wanted to be sure that, and then that parental involvement might jointly affect who you get as a teacher, but also whether you take the SAT or not. That's exactly the kind of endogeneity that the experiment washes away. Now you're so in terms of the internal validity, we're good.
Gotcha.
But your first question about sort of external validity is a fair question because I agree this is a non-generalizable oversample of poor schools in Tennessee in 1985.
Right.
It's not obvious whether that's generalizable outside of Tennessee or to wealthier schools or to today, and that's where the North Carolina will really help us.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I have another question too. So
Sure.
with this white LPM model,
Uh-huh.
so it's like a white student who's placed with a black teacher, there's no like real effect. So could we also then infer from that if a white student is placed with a white teacher, have you looked at like, is it also then a null effect as well, or did you look into that?
So we didn't,
Yeah.
partly because almost every white kid has a white teacher.
Yeah.
So the control group is less.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just wondering if that would maybe, in terms of your hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's a role model effect, maybe that
Mhm.
would apply across racial groups.
That's
But if
right.
it's something about black teachers are better at teaching black students, then
Mhm.
maybe, I
Yeah.
was just curious if you thought about like
So-
looking at map, I'm guessing the only other group is white students, so.
That's right. So so two good points there. There were, I think, 3 Asian students in the data set
Yeah,
that we
exactly.
took out, and there was 1 Hispanic teacher who
Yeah.
we took out.
Speaking
As an aside, doing something with Latinx students and teachers, I think is really important, and I think Rick Hanishek is doing it in Texas with a small group. And I talked with some people up at Stanford about doing this with Miami-Dade. A cool fun fact is that the Miami-Dade superintendent found out about our paper and asked the people at Stanford whether it was true there, and they sort of replicated our result in Miami-Dade, which was nice to hear. So Tom's paper does find a white match effect on test scores when he compares within a student over time. Sometimes they have a white teacher, sometimes they have a black teacher. But actually, I can answer your question better than I thought, because in this pooled model, where the white and black kids are both, there's no separate effect. The only effect is for the black-black match.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you're right. That probably tells us something about the mechanism we could push harder on. Okay. Now another, so just to be clear, like if you're, now's the time to complain if you are worried or confused or nervous about the credibility of these results, because this is the main result. So we're get it out of our system now. Okay. So what's another thing that sort of definitely crossed our mind is, well, maybe this is all driven by 1 or 2 superstar teachers, or 1 or 2 superstar schools with superstar principals. So here we do a leave one out sort of sensitivity check where we just rerun the model, dropping schools 1 at a time, and you'll see that the effects are really remarkably stable around 0.04. So it's not sort of superstar schools that are driving it. And so we feel pretty good about the credibility of these results for college entrance exam taking. And again, as soon as we can do this with the NSC college graduation data, that'll be, I think, really important. But going back to your question, this is also, right, this is a very disadvantaged group, and college is one margin to think about, but high school graduation is another important margin, especially in the mid-80s for this population. So to the extent that we can, we also want to think about effects on high school dropout. Now, I mentioned high school dropouts missing. It's missing for almost half the sample. No one understands why. This was sort of in the early days of thinking about data and experiments and so on. It is totally unclear why the high school dropout data is missing for so many kids. And I think the Krueger and Schonzenbach papers don't even look at high school graduation, I think because they just didn't even want to bother with this messy data. But we do want to bother a little bit, partly because in North Carolina, we do observe the high school dropout data. So just to compare this to that. Now, what we do first to sort of check how big of to check how much we should be concerned about the missing data, we estimate linear probability models where the dummy is 1 if you're missing dropout data. So here, a 1 means we have no idea whether you graduated or not. Your data is totally missing. And what you see is that there's a same-race teacher effect on the probability your data is missing. Having a same-race teacher makes you less likely to have missing dropout data. This is a diagnostic for how endogenous missing data is, but it's also an interesting outcome, I think, by itself, sort of. Because it's saying something about sort of how engaged you remained with school or something, or how mobile you were or something. Anyway, the sign is consistent with role model effects or positive effects of having a same-race teacher. But, the stars here make us nervous about the missing data being a problem. Okay, so with that big caveat, columns 3 and 4 do the naive thing that your econometrics instructor probably told you not to do, which is to estimate the effect on dropout just using the data we have. And again, hands above deck, this is totally a selected sample, and we know that. We're doing it anyway. And the effect is about 3 to 4 percentage points, although there's no stars, and the standard errors are sort of big again. They're big like they were for the kindergarten cohort, which only had about 2,000 kids. Okay. Now, because we know that in North Carolina we're going to get similar estimates, we want to push a little bit harder. So in columns 5 and 6, we try to reclaim that power by imputing, very crudely, high school dropout. And when I say impute, what I mean is we replace the missing data with the graduation rate for kids of your same sex and same socioeconomic status who are in your same school. So very crude, nothing multiple imputee or anything. And what do we see? We see that the point estimates are quite similar to these, but the standard errors get smaller and they're more precisely estimated. But you should listen to your econometrics instructor and be a little skeptical of this. So the cool figure we made was to think about sort of what do we get if we make really bizarre assumptions about the missing data. So what if we assume that everybody who's missing data graduated, which is a very strong and weird assumption, because the people who are missing data are much more likely to have dropped out. But if we make that very strong assumption in the wrong direction, we still get a negative point estimate of 0.01. So dropout is less likely, which is a good outcome. Although it's not significantly different from 0, these are confidence intervals. And as we slowly move to a more realistic number, and this red line is the sort of the average imputed value that you would get. As we move to a more realistic assumption, the estimates get closer to that negative 0.04, and then they become significant at about here. So I guess the other sort of thing to note is that whether you assume 0 or 1, this line is still fairly flat, right? The effect is only moving from minus 0.01 to minus 0.04. And really, if you cut out the extremes, like you're somewhere in this range of like 3 to 4, which is what our regression tells us. And so that's something. And then the North Carolina data is going to basically confirm that this is sort of roughly the effect. Oh geez, all right. So we could talk about the mechanisms stuff if you have questions. The short answer is we find no effects on middle school test scores. The survey is really not so great. Consistent with Keith Knight's cartoon, we find no dosage effects, which is interesting. This is the effect of exactly 1 black teacher, this is the effect of exactly 2, and they're essentially the same, but not different. So, but again, this is limited by the fact that we can only look at dosage for people that were there for at least 2 years, and of course staying in the sample is not random. But in the last few minutes, I'm going to jump ahead to North Carolina. So I think the STAR stuff is pretty convincing in terms of internal validity, but it's old and it's a unique sample. So North Carolina adds a lot, much more power, richer data, and so on. So we're going to look at 5 cohorts who are old enough to sort of see the graduation outcomes. And we're going to focus on black students. And we're going to use Michelmore and Donarski's definition of persistently poor. Those are kids who are always free lunch eligible. About half the sample fits that criteria. And then here we don't have an experiment. So here we have to think about internal validity a lot harder. And the endogenous variable in our basic model is just, did you have at least 1 black teacher in grades 3 to 5? And of course, that could be endogenous for a lot of reasons. Your parents might call the school and try to get you into a special classroom. They might switch schools based on the composition of who's teaching in the school. So we have to deal with this endogeneity. And the way we deal with it is using a Bettinger and Long IV, which is essentially within school variation over time in the racial composition of the teaching force. And their paper does this in the context of college and the gender ratio of faculties, but we do the same thing for schools. And the reason this might be random is that within a school, the fraction of black teachers changes from year to year due to things like retirements and maternity leaves and sabbaticals and new hires and so on. So, conditional on school fixed effects and a bunch of other stuff, we might isolate random variation in the share of teachers, and that can be an instrument for whether you have a black teacher or not. And that relationship is mechanical, right? The more black teachers in a grade, the higher chances any student has of having a black teacher. And then our outcomes here, we don't have SAT taking, but we do have junior year stated college intent, which is basically the student's answer to the question of what do you want to do after, what are you planning to do after high school? And if they said anything about going to a 4-year college or university, we code that as college intent. Okay, so then we see, did you drop out, did you graduate, or did you graduate and state intent? Yeah?
Is there a reason why you didn't look at grade levels comparable to STAR? So like kindergarten
Yes.
to grade 3, because now you're kind of starting at grade 3 onwards. And
Yes.
why not later grade levels? Like to see if the effect is a early ed effect or something.
Yeah, so we can't go earlier because there's not student-teacher links in the earlier grades for these cohorts. However, starting in, I think, 2010, there is a student course file that does link all K to 5 teachers, but those kids aren't old enough to have graduated high school yet.
Yeah.
So, an enterprising student in the room should do this in 2 years with the data that does link all the K. The reason we don't do older grades is that then you end up, in middle school and high school, you end up with multiple teachers, and that just gets, that's harder, and we were lazy a little bit. But that's another thing that, if not us, someone will do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is proof of concept for now. But yes, doing it carefully in high school is a good idea. Yeah?
Was there a reason why you only took the 4-year interest in school as college intent and not the 2-year?
Yes, also for just simplicity. We could have broken it out into a fourth category, and yeah, maybe we should.
I think given that they are low income, I think we've seen effects where low income.
I think you're right.
Do that.
I think you're right. What we see for these three is sort of a clear gradient, and I think if we added that fourth category, I suspect it would fit on the same gradient, but we should do that. Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so this is what's happening in 3rd through 5. Half the kids never have a black teacher in grades 3 to 5. And if they never have a black teacher in 3 to 5, it's likely they never have a black teacher in K to 5, and we show that that's true. On the other hand, having 3 consecutive black teachers is also pretty rare. So the point here is that there's a lot of variation, and there's a lot of kids who have one, but not all. Okay, so this is the sort of the IV model that we're estimating. Ever match is a function of, so this is the endogenous variable, and it's a function of our instrument and some student stuff and some school fixed effects. And then we just do plain old instrumental variables, and so we should move on to our, actually let me say 2 quick things. First, the first stage is mechanical and trivial, but we remember the second assumption of a good instrument is the exclusion restriction, which means that the instrument only affects the outcome via the endogenous variable. So the only reason that the share of black teachers in your school affects your outcome is by changing your odds of having a black teacher. That's the exclusion restriction. Now, if you were paying attention to the cartoon at the beginning, you think that that's maybe not a good assumption, right? Because what if there's a black teacher down the hall who you see at study hall and you see in the lunchroom? Well, that's who's driving the instrument, and if that person changes you in any way, then the exclusion restriction would technically fail. So the IV turns out to work, but we could also do the reduced form, which is a different research question, but it's the same basic idea, and that is, does random variation in the share of black teachers in the school affect your outcome? And the answer there is yes. And so let's look at those reduced forms, and here we have power to split things up by race and by poverty status. Remember in STAR, basically everybody was poor, so we couldn't separate by SES, and also the sample is too small to do much by gender. Here we have big samples, and when you look at the effect of the racial makeup of a school's teachers on student outcomes, you see that overall there's essentially no effect. Marginal effects, but they're small and not very significant. But when you cut the sample to persistently poor, you do see big, precise effects. And when you cut the sample by sex, this is where the Chetty thing becomes interesting again. The effects are totally driven by persistently poor males. So these are 3rd through 5th grade black boys who are much less likely to drop out and are much more likely to state a college intent. The signs are in the right direction for the girls, but they're not statistically significant. Okay, now this is interesting for a few reasons on top of even beyond Chetty, and the main one is this is who's in the Tennessee STAR sample mostly because of what schools participated in STAR. So I think this reaffirms the STAR stuff. Another point is that the magnitudes are sort of remarkably on point. So how do you interpret this? Remember, this is the effect of the share of teachers who are black. So this point estimate is the effect of going from 0% to 100%. Now that's a bad out-of-sample thing to do, but what if you just think about moving from 25% black to 75% black? Well, that just means dividing this in half or multiplying it by 0.5. So moving from 25% to 75%, reduces the dropout rate by about 3.5 percentage points. That's exactly what STAR said. Increases college intent by about 4.5 percentage points. That's exactly what STAR said. So that's pretty remarkable that it sort of replicates. Last thing I'll say is, if we want to push on the role model idea, sort of what's happening with the role model? Well, for a lot of kids, the teacher is the only college-educated person they routinely come in contact with, unless your parents went to college. So North Carolina lets us split the sample by college, and what do we see? If we look at the kids who have a college-educated parent, there's no effects. All the effects are driven by the boys who don't have a college-educated parent. So again, this lines up with the role model story, sort of, I think, in an interesting way. Separate, sort of in a different way than the poverty stuff does. So, all right, I want to leave room for questions, so let me say a lot of what we're doing in our model about updating is consistent with lots of sort of ideas in education and economics and psychology and so on. And in terms of policy, the obvious takeaway is increase students' exposure to same-race teachers. And this is a well-defined sort of policy that you could imagine enacting. But we also view it as a longer-run goal in the sense that building the pipeline can't happen overnight, and people are absolutely working on building a pipeline, but it takes time. Something that gets overlooked a lot, I think, is retaining the teachers of color who are in schools, and I think there's a really interesting session at ARA that Travis Bristol's organizing that I'm excited to go to and see. But so it's more than just recruitment, it's the whole package of recruitment, retention, et cetera. The two really cool interventions, I think, though, that are absolutely scalable in the short run are sort of light touch, low cost things that teachers of all racial and ethnic backgrounds benefit from, and students benefit from indirectly. The first is this really neat experiment in France where it was 10th grade science classrooms, and it was a true RCT, carefully done. They randomly were assigned a male or female sort of grown-up scientist to visit the classroom and talk about what they do in their job. And the classrooms that got a female scientist, those students 2 years later were much more likely to apply for selective science majors in college. So this was sort of a 1 hour, one-off thing where the female scientist role model helped females engagement with science. The other thing closer to home in California is Jason Okonofwa is now at Berkeley, and he's been doing this empathetic discipline intervention, which again is a light touch 45-minute thing where basically they just help teachers empathize with students, and as a result, discipline, suspensions fell and student test scores increased for teachers of all backgrounds. And it's a really cheap, low cost thing. So these types of things can be done while we're working on number one, I guess is the point. And so we do have time for questions, I hope. And
Yeah,
sorry for going a little long.
Why don't you take your own question?
Yeah, sure.
I do have to dip out soon. I'm fascinated by this and appreciate all the work. I did Teach for America, so I taught in Detroit, and then I taught in South Central. Now I'm in East LA. First, what's the best way to continue to reach out to you? I'd love to get more information. Is there
you can email me or
okay.
I think.
And then I did have a question. Are there similar studies to see the impact of same-race educators, or sorry, not educators, school leaders, and the relationship between school leader, racial group, and if that matches their teaching population, how that matches student population? I'm sure that makes it much more complicated. But
I think it's complicated. So my co-author Nick is also a TFA teacher, and as an aside, he was teaching a bilingual school in the Bronx, and our whole research agenda about expectations came out of his sort of anecdotal experience about why don't the other teachers have expectations for the kids. So anyway, my other co-author Constance, I think, is working on the principal stuff, but I think I don't know that the careful paper's been written yet, but I think she's probably working on it. And if anyone has data and could do it, I think there's a really sort of simple way to do it, which would be to sort of do a diff and diff where you compare principal changes where the race stayed the same to principal changes where the race changed. So like if you have a big data set where you have schools that have white principals and they both turn over, but one turns over to a black principal and one doesn't, I think you could, hopefully, I think you'd be able to sort of leverage something there. But I think that's an important question. A related question is like, if that affects kids, why does that happen? And is it happening because something the principal's doing in the school, or is it changing who they hire? Is it changing how they talk to teachers? So I think like another outcome is like when the principal race changes, what happens to the teacher flow in and out of school and things like that. Yeah.
Two quick questions about adults and more on kids. Back at the beginning, you were talking about that you could see some of these effects even in law school. So
Yeah.
so you're dealing with adults at this point. So this kind of relates to you sort of tangentially touched it with the study in France.
Yeah.
But if you have, are there gender effects where if you have a female student or even graduate student in a STEM discipline and they're exposed to a female instructor, does that help their persistence in staying in STEM?
Yes. So in our context in STAR, there was only 3 male teachers. So there's just nothing to do in it. But in the college setting, yes. The Bettinger and Long paper I mentioned does exactly that with the sex of the instructor. And then Scott Carell uses data from the Air Force Academy where they randomly assign, they randomly generate schedules, and they do stuff with the gender.
Okay. And what about in the realm of professional development? Are there any effects from having, say, predominantly African-American K-5 teachers receiving professional development in math, say, from an African-American?
That's really interesting. I don't know of any studies on that. The closest I know of is Dan Goldhaber did something similar where he looks at, for pre-service teachers, does where they do their student teaching matter, and they find that it does. And this is related to sort of a new project that we're working on, which is sort of like the returns to teaching experience depend on the type of students you're teaching. So it's sort of a similar idea. But no, there's a bunch about the race match of the college instructor, but I don't think it's in the context of an ed school or a teacher training program, but that would be interesting.
We have time for one more question.
Sure.
So one of the effects is possibly role modeling, I think. But I think it's more complicated than that. I think it has to do with race and racism, and that black teachers, and you didn't mention whether they were self-identified as black teachers, were they American black, I mean, but putting that aside, I think that part of what may be going on is that black teachers understand that the classroom is a racialized space and interact with their students probably in different ways than white teachers do with black students. In fact, it's probably, I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence about that.
Yeah, and so that comes back to so that was like channel 2.
Oh, and I was thinking if Cornell West was sitting here, or Bell Hooks, they would say it's because black teachers love their black students.
Yes, and I think that's consistent with the empathy experiments. And so there is and I think it's related to the expectation stuff as well. So I think, for me at least, my reading of teacher effectiveness literature has always talked about like value-added scores or years of experience. in a way that assumes that this effectiveness is a singular thing, and you're either an effective teacher or you're not.
Right.
But I fully, totally agree with you that